Imagine possessing a voice so thunderous, so electrically charged, a voice that literally defined an entire generation, a voice that won Grammys, that commanded sold-out arenas across the globe, and was fiercely adored by the Queen of Soul herself. Now, imagine that same man, decades later, trapped in a sterile, dimly lit Chicago high-rise, paralyzed and absolutely terrified. It's January 2018. An investigator from the Department on Aging responds to a frantic, anonymous tip. What they find inside that luxury apartment is a scene of unimaginable cruelty. The man who once roared the iconic opening lines of "Papa was a Rollin Stone," he's lying in a hospital bed, a mere shadow of his former glory. But the most chilling detail isn't his failing health. It's the fact that his hearing aids have been deliberately removed for a musical god. Taking away his sound is the ultimate psychological torture. When the investigator leans close, the frail legend musters just enough air. He whispers a devastating accusation. He's being suffocated. He claims his own wife is waiting for the dark, waiting to press a pillow over his face, silencing him forever. An emergency protective order is filed. A rescue is planned, but he never makes it out. 24 hours before a judge can legally pull him from that nightmare. He's dead. This isn't just a tragic end to a Motown legend. This is the harrowing, untold story of Dennis Edwards, a man who spent his entire life using his earth-shattering voice, using it to escape the crushing control of a strict father, a ruthless music empire, and his own crippling demons, only to have his final breaths violently stolen in the suffocating silence. How did the savior of the Temptations end up fighting for his life against the one person he trusted most? Let's uncover the truth they tried to bury. The genesis of this tragedy didn't begin under blinding neon lights, not in a roaring metropolis. It started in the suffocating, incense-heavy air of a red brick church in Fairfield, Alabama. Long before the world knew Dennis Edwards as a man draped in custom-tailored silk tuxedos, he was just a small, 10-year-old boy standing before a congregation. But the moment that boy opened his mouth to sing, a collective chill swept through the wooden pews. That was not the voice of a child. It was impossibly thick, dangerously textured, and bleeding with an ancient ache. He sang as though his small lungs were carrying the heavy sighs of a century filled with torment and a desperate plea for salvation. But in Dennis's world, music was never allowed to be an innocent escape. He grew up under the iron-fisted, dogmatic rule of a preacher father, a man who would pound the pulpit, who would brand a psychological death sentence into his son's mind. Secular music, the swaying, rhythmic pulse of the streets, was the devil's music. To sing it was to purchase a one-way ticket to the lake of fire. This was the very first cage built around Dennis. He was a boy starving to sing the music of freedom, yet paralyzed by the terror of divine punishment. He eventually made the fateful choice to cross that line. But deep within his soul, he carried a crushing, agonizing guilt. He was a boy, conditioned to believe he was bound for hell, who decided he might as well sing his way down. Destiny soon pulled his family into the Great Migration, dragging them north into the roaring, unrelenting belly of Detroit, Michigan. The Detroit of the 1950s was a two-faced monster. By day, it drained the life out of men, lost in the gray, choking exhaust of the auto plants. But by night, the industrial grime washed away. The city transformed into a seductive, neon-lit incubator for rhythm and blues. And, right here, a massive empire was rising from the concrete. Motown Records. People love to romanticize Motown. They picture it as a warm, familial haven for brilliant artists. But the brutal truth, the reality, the industry worked tirelessly to hide, was that Motown operated as a ruthless, human-grinding machine under the iron grip of Berry Gordy. It was an emotionless assembly line. When a talent scout accidentally witnessed Dennis's earth-shattering vocals in a cramped, smoke-filled bar, he immediately called Gordy. Gordy listened. Gordy nodded. And then, Gordy locked him away. The Motown mogul recognized the raw, volatile power roaring inside Dennis, but the machine simply didn't have a slot for him yet. So, Gordy handed the young singer a retainer contract, $250 a week. It sounded like a generous lifeline, but in reality, it was an invisible chain, binding him to a golden cage. For 2 agonizing years, Dennis Edwards was reduced to a ghost, haunting the vibrant hallways of Hitsville, USA. He wasn't allowed to record a single song. He wasn't assigned to a group. He was forced to stand in the dim corners, grinding his teeth, swallowing his desperate need to scream, all while watching legends like Marvin Gaye and Diana Ross walking past him, bathed in blinding glory. For a man born to make noise, this mandated silence was a slow, suffocating execution of his spirit until one night, a desperate phone call shattered those chains. A singer for one of Motown's touring acts, the Contours, had suddenly fallen violently ill, and they needed an immediate replacement. That night, when Dennis Edwards stepped out of the shadows and his hand gripped the cold steel of the microphone, it wasn't just a musical performance, it was a violent eruption. It was a starved, caged beast, finally tearing through the iron bars. His voice ripped through the venue, swallowing the audience whole, drowning them in a wild, furious energy that had been suppressed for far too long. On that stage, the frightened, guilt-ridden church boy from Alabama took his final breath. In his place stood a ferocious, uncontrollable storm. Motown had unwittingly unlocked the cage, entirely unaware that the musical monster they just set free would forever alter the history of their empire and ultimately consume itself in a blazing, tragic fire. By 1968, the immaculate, velvet-draped image of Motown's crown jewels, The Temptations, it was quietly bleeding out behind closed doors. David Ruffin, the golden, bespectacled superstar who sang My Girl, was spiraling, his transcendent talent slowly being swallowed whole, consumed by a monstrous ego and the dark allure of cocaine. The group was losing its rhythm, and the Motown machine demanded a savior. In a beautifully tragic twist of fate, it was the fallen king who anointed his own successor. Ruffin approached Dennis Edwards with a chilling warning. They were going to replace him, and Dennis was the only man who could carry the weight. But stepping into Ruffin's shoes wasn't a coronation. It was a brutal, heavy cross to bear. When the official call came, Dennis hesitated. He knew that in the churning, emotionless gears of Berry Gordy's empire, you could be treated like a god on Tuesday and be entirely erased from history by Wednesday. Still, the boy who had spent 2 years locked in a silent cage, he couldn't refuse the spotlight. He swallowed his fear, signed his name, and stepped into the fire. At his very first rehearsal, music royalty stood in the room. But the second Dennis leaned into the microphone, the atmosphere shifted. He didn't even try to mimic Ruffin's polished perfection. Instead, Dennis brought the grit. His voice was rough, unpolished, and bleeding with an undeniable, street-level urgency. It was the explosive sound of a holy Sunday morning violently colliding with a reckless Saturday night. And it was exactly what the world needed. The late 1960s were fracturing. The naive dream of innocent candlelight romance. It was being crushed under the heavy boots of the Vietnam War, civil rights riots, and a surging drug epidemic. Dennis flat out refused to sing about sunshine and roses. With his arrival, he transformed the Temptations from smooth, synchronized crooners into the gritty prophets of a broken generation. When they dropped Cloud 9, the world stopped spinning. Dennis's raw vocal power pioneered psychedelic soul, dragging Motown into a new, rebellious era and earning the label its very first Grammy Award. Then came the absolute masterpiece. When Dennis delivered the haunting opening lines of Papa Was a Rollin Stone, he didn't just sing a hit record. He delivered a dark prophecy. He turned every stage into his own personal church, transforming the microphone into a pulpit to preach the brutal, uncomfortable truths of abandoned families and lost fathers in a restless America. In front of a crowd, he moved like a man possessed. Sweat poured down his face. His eyes blazed with a manic intensity, and his booming voice commanded the souls of thousands. He was the undisputed storm center of every single arena he walked into. But this is where the grand illusion of Dennis Edwards truly begins. Because while he was screaming for freedom under the blinding stage lights, he was quietly suffocating in the dark. Despite being the undeniable gravitational pull of the group, Dennis was living a lie. Behind the dazzling choreography, a bitter, vicious civil war was tearing the Temptations apart. The founding members, Otis Williams and Melvin Franklin, they fiercely protected their ownership of the group's name and brand. To them, Dennis was getting too loud, too popular, and too uncontrollable. And here lay the most devastating tragedy of his career. To the millions of fans screaming his name, Dennis Edwards was a musical god, but inside the freezing corporate boardrooms of Motown, he was nothing more than a hired employee. The louder his voice echoed across the globe, the less power he actually held over his own destiny. The brotherhood that had built Cloud 9 was poisoned by intense jealousy and ruthless power struggles. Dennis realized he had simply traded his strict father's church for a much larger, much more glamorous cage. Amidst this suffocating isolation, a rare, beautiful moment of salvation emerged from the shadows. Backstage at a Detroit benefit concert, Dennis crossed paths with the Queen of Soul herself, Aretha Franklin. It was a collision of perfect mirrors. They were both immensely powerful, yet deeply wounded. Both were preachers' kids who had crossed the forbidden line from holy gospel to the secular world, carrying the exact same heavy guilt. Aretha looked at Dennis and didn't see the untamed superstar. She saw the frightened, lonely boy from Alabama. She fell for him, truly, deeply, and unconditionally. Aretha envisioned a quiet, peaceful life for them, far away from the deafening noise and the parasitic executives of the music industry. She immortalized this desperate hope in her 1972 classic song, Daydreaming, written entirely about Dennis. She offered him the one thing he had been searching for his entire life, a safe harbor. But peace is a terrifying concept to a man who has only ever known chaos. Dennis was too restless, too deeply scarred by the industry, to accept a quiet life. The late-night disappearances began. The whispered names of other women started echoing down the sterile hotel hallways. The fatal blow was finally struck when Aretha discovered his devastating affair with Ruth Pointer of the Pointer Sisters. Her heart broke in absolute silence. They never spoke again. In one reckless, self-destructive move, Dennis severed the only tether he had left to reality. He lost the one person in the world who truly understood the price of a thunderous voice. With his heart shattered and the internal pressure from his bandmates mounting to a boiling point, the silence of empty hotel rooms became too loud for Dennis to bear. That's when the white powder quietly wove its way into his life. At first, cocaine wasn't a party. It was an anesthetic. It was a chemical illusion that gave him a fleeting, false sense of control over his own life. It convinced him the music was still playing, even when the room went dead quiet. But the drug quickly turned on him, amplifying his deepest paranoias. In the recording studio, the man who was once a force of nature became wildly unpredictable. Some days he would walk in completely sober, command the room, and deliver pure magic in a single take. Other times, he would vanish for days on end, hopelessly chasing a high, trying to numb the profound realization that he owned absolutely nothing of the legacy he was building. The same fire that made him an unstoppable legend was now rapidly eating him alive. The backstage area turned into a war zone. Dennis clashed violently with Otis and Melvin, his booming voice echoing through the corridors. In furious, desperate screaming matches, fighting over stolen spotlights and unpaid dues. The tension became radioactive. The machine realized that the beast they had unleashed was no longer generating enough profit to justify the headache. Finally, in 1977, the ultimate betrayal was executed. The very man who had single-handedly lifted the Temptations from the ashes, the voice that had dragged Motown into a new era, he was coldly told to pack his bags. He was fired. The voice that had saved them had simply become too real, too unvarnished, and too loud for the corporate machine to handle. They wrung every ounce of magic from his vocal cords and discarded him. But as Dennis Edwards was about to painfully learn, the silence of being cast out of the kingdom, it was nothing. Nothing compared to the terrifying, suffocating silence that was waiting for him at the end of his life. The wilderness outside the Motown machine was cold and unforgiving. By 1980, Dennis Edwards found himself caught in a cruel, spinning revolving door. The label attempted a highly anticipated reunion, bringing him back alongside a deeply addicted David Ruffin and a physically ailing Eddie Kendricks. But the magic was gone, replaced by absolute chaos. The tour collapsed almost as quickly as it began, leaving Dennis to stare at a silent telephone once again, determined to prove that his voice was an unbreakable force of nature. Dennis fought for his own resurrection. In 1984, he unleashed a hypnotic, slick solo hit, Don't Look Any Further. The track surged up the R&B charts, a brilliant flash of lightning that reminded the world of the beast lurking in his vocal cords. Yet, it was only a temporary reprieve. The glittering music industry was rapidly evolving, and the ghosts of his past, the cocaine, the crippling paranoia, and the desperate need to escape, they refused to leave him be, following one final, disastrous reunion attempt in 1987. He was fired from the Temptations. For the third and absolute final time, the industry packed up and moved on, leaving Dennis behind, holding nothing but a fading legacy and a voice that no corporate executive could ever truly own. As the decades slipped away, the man who once commanded colossal stadiums found himself quietly settling in St. Louis, surviving on the echoes of his past. The venues shrank to dimly lit casino lounges, state fairs, and local blues festivals. He was older now, his steps noticeably heavier, his breathing a little more labored. But those who were lucky enough to be in the room, they whispered that with a single gravelly growl, he could still shake the walls and bring a crowd to its knees. The sacred fire inside him simply refused to die. But the years of living fast and recklessly had finally caught up to his fragile body. In 2017, the unimaginable happened. Dennis was struck down by meningitis, a severe and terrifying inflammation of the brain and spinal cord. The devastating illness ravaged his nervous system, leaving him incredibly weak, nearly completely paralyzed, and permanently confined to a hospital bed. The tragic irony was almost too agonizing to bear. The electrifying storm center of Motown, a man who once moved across the stage as if possessed by the rhythm itself, he was now entirely unable to lift his own arms. The blinding, intoxicating spotlight was permanently extinguished, replaced only by the cold, sterile, rhythmic hum of medical machines in the dark. And this brings us back to that terrifying mystery in the quiet Chicago high-rise. Hoping to secure better medical treatment, his wife of 18 years, Brenda Edwards, she relocated him to a luxury apartment in Illinois, but within the walls of that expensive, isolated sanctuary, dark and suffocating shadows began to grow. When investigators from the Department on Aging finally breached the apartment, following that urgent, anonymous tip, they found a man fighting a horrifying psychological war. Dennis, frail but entirely lucid, gasped out his final chilling accusations. He whispered that his own wife was waiting for the quiet of the night to press a pillow over his face. But perhaps the most merciless detail of this entire nightmare, the detail that elevates this from a tragic ending to a story of profound psychological cruelty, was the deliberate removal of his hearing aids. For a man whose entire existence, whose very soul was defined by sound and rhythm, taking away his ability to hear was the ultimate form of isolation. It was a harrowing, literal manifestation of his deepest lifelong fear. The world's most powerful voice was being systematically, intentionally silenced. He was stripped of his music, stripped of his movement, and plunged into a terrifying, muted darkness. An emergency protection order was swiftly filed to extract him from the apartment. The accusations tore his family apart. Brenda vehemently and tearfully denied the allegations, sobbing to reporters that she loved him deeply and would never lay a hand on her husband. Yet, his own daughter believed the absolute worst, revealing that her father's final words to her were utterly consumed by terror. Desperate, broken whispers of deep betrayal and agonizing fear. The legal battle to legally rescue Dennis Edwards. It was scheduled for a hearing on February 2nd, 2018. It was supposed to be the day he finally broke free from his last cage, but the gavel never had the chance to fall. Dennis Edwards took his final breath on February 1st, exactly 24 hours before the court date, and just 2 days shy of his 75th birthday. The Cook County Medical Examiner's Office ruled his death as complications from meningitis, stating they found absolutely no signs of external trauma, no bruising, no physical evidence of suffocation. But official paperwork rarely extinguishes the raging fire of public doubt. Fans, estranged family members, and aging Motown veterans fiercely debated the circumstances. Behind closed doors, the timing was simply too perfect, the silence too absolute. Did the legendary Dennis Edwards succumb to a tragic, natural physical decline? Or was there something much darker, much more sinister, hiding in the suffocating quiet of that Chicago apartment? The truth remains entirely out of reach, a hauntingly blurred line between devotion, obsession, and ultimate control. When the day of his funeral finally arrived, the sanctuary was packed with the ghosts of Motown, the aging men and women who had built an empire alongside him. As his iconic booming voice filled the silent room through the speakers, singing those legendary opening lines of "Papa was a Rollin Stone," every tear, every bitter rumor, and every decade-old grudge simply melted away. All that remained was the pure, undeniable sound, the sound of a man who gave absolutely everything he had to the music. Yet, the agonizing, open question still lingers. In the cold Chicago air, was his death merely a tragic, perfectly timed surrender to a devastating illness, or was it a flawless crime, shrouded under the guise of medical failure? The cruelest possible irony for a man who spent his entire existence running from the silence. We may never know the absolute truth. The terrifying mystery of his final hours is forever buried beneath the earth. But his earthly body was the only thing this world could ever truly trap. That thunderous, untamed voice will never die. Somewhere, in a place far beyond the reach of corporate machines and silent, dark rooms, that golden roar rises once again. Dennis Edwards is finally and forever free.